This happened when myself, my brother from another mother, and some other guys decided on going for a cross-country road trip the summer after we graduated high school. Some of us were signing up with the military when we got back. Others were going off to a college of their choice. But one of us, Baker, he had plans for going off to Europe for a few years to backpack and see the sights of the old country. He was also a massive paranormal fanboy. Anything remotely creepy or paranormal would grab his gut, and he'd run off head first into whatever situation had just arisen, just to sate his curiosity. Most of us liked paranormal shit, or at least tolerated his shenanigans, because usually it ended up with us exploring some old busted-ass buildings or houses, and once, an entire ass beach steamboat that had seen much better days. So, when Baker announced he was plotting our course across the country to hit as many paranormal/creepy spots as possible, none of us were surprised, nor did we express any sort of argument against it. We just rolled with it, in the spirit of adventure. This trip would go on to be a fucking blast. Some spots were genuinely creepy. Others were a letdown. Mostly the fun came from each of us trying to scare the bejesus out of each other whenever possible, which, admittedly, was whenever we could do it, and the journey to each spot. That all changed when we hit New Mexico. Baker was originally from NM, having moved out of there when he was still shitting yellow in his diapers, and was almost hell-bent on having us stop as much as possible when we were driving through here. We didn't mind. Most of us had never left our home state, so everything was new to us, and we were generally enjoying ourselves. We made a stop in Animas at Baker's request. Apparently, he had family that lived there, and they'd agreed to let us crash at their place for the night. We figured why not. We wouldn't have to set up camp or rent a hotel, and Baker would get to see family he had not ever met before. It's a win-win. We pull up to their place. Baker hops out and walks up, starts talking to an older guy in his 50s who walked out of the house for a few minutes. Then the two of them walk back towards our vehicle. Introductions are made, and we find out the guy is Baker's only uncle. We shoot the shit for a bit, when his uncle tells us he has their old bunkhouse from back when they had a little ranch ready for us to stay in. This was considered a great win for us, as that meant no double bunking and that everyone actually got a bed for once instead of a sleeping bag or a cot. So we pull around to where it is and unload our stuff for the evening and get our beds picked and set up for the night. We get dinner situated and end up eating outside around a fire pit alongside Baker's uncle, who was shooting the shit with us while catching up with Baker about his family. Pretty soon though, of course, Baker turns the talk towards spooky shit in the area, and we all see his uncle's face sort of fall, like someone who is trying not to think of some bad shit that happened, so people don't realize they hit a nerve. Sits there for a few minutes silently, Baker badgering him about it, until he gets up and walks inside. We all start giving Baker shit, because from what we can all just tell, he just ruined his uncle's night, and he falls into that defensive silence someone who knows they fucked up tends to put on. But a few minutes later, his uncle walks back out, a bottle of tequila in hand, and 8 glasses. He passes one to each of us, pours each of us about 3 fingers worth, and then takes a good long swig of it, while staring into the fire. Then, he takes a seat, and he starts to talk. He begins to tell us about an event that had happened roughly 30 years before, about how he'd lost a friend and a lover to it, and that if we really wanted to hear something creepy, then we would shut the fuck up and listen, because he was only going to tell us this once. So, we all sat back, buttoned up our lips, and let the man speak. It started off him telling us about his friend and his friend's brother, and how the 3 of them had met while working as miners and had quickly become fast friends. He said he became a miner so he would not have to deal with working the ranch, a job he hated, and that the 2 men he met made the job bearable, but only barely. Since they were Mexican, they usually got the short end of the stick, but as long as they were together, they could deal with it. Then, the uncle and his friend's brother slowly began to realize that the 2 of them were more alike than they thought, leading to the 2 men confessing that they swung for the same team, and they quickly began a relationship in secret. He said he told us this so that we would know how painful it was for him to talk about the event. Baker looked surprised. He didn't have the best track record with same-sex couples, and the shock of finding out his only uncle was a part of that lifestyle was pretty evident on his face. But he kept his mouth shut as his uncle continued on. A few months into the men meeting one another, ranchers in the area started reporting missing animals, or finding animals dead and desiccated where the day before the animal would have been alive and in good health. Of course, that got the local ranchers agitated, and regular hunting parties were organized to see if the animal or person responsible could be found and either killed if it was an animal or brought to justice if it was a man. I don't need to tell y'all what kind of justice his uncle was talking about. I'm sure y'all can put two and two together. This continued on into winter months. At this part, his uncle took a short pause, still staring into the fire, then took a shot from the tequila and then continued. The ranchers were getting more and more angry. They were losing animals, but had yet to find any sort of tracks or traces of whatever or whoever was doing it. Hell, even the miners began to talk about it, whispering that if it was some sort of animal taking down cattle, whatever it was would be able to take a person down as well, especially if it was a mountain lion or similar. They also began to talk about hearing weird noises in the deeper mine shafts, stuff like faint growling, or what sounded like claws moving across rock. Some of them began refusing to go into the deep unless they had more than one other person with them, something that earned those miners nervous laughter from the rest of them and calls of them being cowards and pussies. Baker's uncle told us how he, his friend, and his lover would routinely be forced to work the deeper shafts, since the others would either refuse to go down there or were higher seniority on the miner totem pole, and that it would just be them for hours at a time down there. Eventually, the three of them stopped bitching about it and just focused on their work, figuring the faster they dug during their shifts, the faster they would get out. He said they would occasionally hear the noises that the other miners reported, but would try to ignore them as best as they could and focus on their work. It worked, until the night that it didn't. He told us that they had gotten the graveyard shaft that night, as well as the deepest part of the shaft they were assigned to, so off the three went, grumbling under their breath about the whole situation. They stepped out of the elevator, and the guys going up had scared looks on their faces, so Baker's uncle asked one of them that he was on somewhat cordial speaking terms with what was wrong. The guy seemed to hesitate, then told the three that they had been hearing strange noises coming from the lower shafts all shift, and that they had been pretty disturbing, but that they had attributed it to wind gusting through from an unknown cave connected to the shaft, and that the proper authorities would be checking it out the next day to make sure that part of the mine shaft was in no danger of collapsing, but for them to be careful, since they were going to be right smack dab in the middle of it all. That did not make the three men feel any better as they walked towards where they had been assigned, setting about getting to work. 10 minutes into their shift, the lights went out. From the way he said it, it seemed like the lines had been cut. One moment, they were all lit. The next, they were standing in complete and utter darkness, with only the sound of each other breathing, letting them know the other two were still there. They scramble to get their helmet lights turned on, and while doing so, they start hearing the claw on rock noise approaching fast. He said that as far as he knew, the other two felt like he did, that something bad was coming their way, so the three of them began booking it back towards the lift. The clawing sound picked up speed, almost like it was running full tilt at them, when he heard his friend scream in pain and fear. He said his lover and himself turned to see his friend and lover's brother laying face down on the ground, his body going limp, as what he described as an albino, almost hairless rat dog took a chunk out of his neck, looking at the two of them before letting out a squeal like the cross between an angry cat hissing and grease sizzling on a hot skillet. The two of them turned and began running again, him saying that he disgustingly hoped that whatever it was would have stopped to eat his friend so the two of them could get away, and being absolutely terrified when he heard those clawing noises getting close. That's when Baker's uncle stopped talking again, still staring into the fire. He was quiet for so long, we began to assume that he was either not going to tell the rest of what happened or that he'd gotten too drunk to remember it. Neither of those was the case, That's when I felt him grab me and throw me out of the way, and I saw the thing fly past me, barely missing. We weren't too far from the elevator, and thankfully the power was still on in that part of the mineshaft, so we hoped like a motherfucker that the lights would act as a deterrent. They didn't do shit. He told us how his lover pushed him into the elevator as the rat dog thing charged at them and tried to get in, while the thing was picking itself up off the ground, already starting to charge at them. The thing was fast, too fast, and in what he said was almost an eye blink, it was on his lover, biting and scratching at him before finally tearing out his throat. He said for the second time that night, he felt disgusted at how he felt as he slapped the ascent button on the lift, part of him hoping it would hurry, and the other part cussing at him for being a coward and not helping out his lover. The lift began to ascend, and he said the thing locked eyes with him and screeched, charging. Luckily for him, it apparently could not climb and barely missed the lift, smacking headlong into the mineshaft wall. He said he could hear it screeching the entire way up, with the miners who had gathered around the top of the elevator shaft hearing it as well. One of them asked where the other two men were, and why he looked so terrified. So, working quickly, he concocted a story about how there was an albino wolf that had somehow gotten into the shaft that ended up killing both of his partners. It was here that his uncle fell silent for the third time that night, this time for much longer. So long that we began to worry about him, though he did stand up slowly after a few moments, excusing himself. All of us were quiet after he went inside the house, contemplating whether or not what we just heard was real or not. Most of us came to the same conclusion, that his uncle was telling some form of the truth. But Baker came to a totally different conclusion. Baker wanted to go see the shaft in person. We all began discussing it amongst ourselves, and eventually we all, minus Baker, came to the conclusion that Baker had a death wish, but he would just not let it go, and eventually persuaded every one of us that it was the spirit of adventure calling, and that there were 8 of us, so whatever it was would not try anything, if there was in fact something to the story. So we all filed into the bunkhouse, with a plan forming to go monster hunting. The next morning we awoke, wondering if Baker would still be dead set on his little monster hunting adventure, mostly because all of us during the night had come to the same conclusion. None of us wanted to go spelunking in some old mine shafts and run the risk of something happening and all of us getting trapped down there. But when Baker awoke, the first thing out of his mouth when he walked out to the kitchen was to ask if we were all ready for it. Half-hearted affirms were had from some of us. Others were saying various things about safety issues, but he brushed them aside and simply stated that if we weren't going with him, he'd go it alone. The rest of us shared a look, knowing that none of us were going to let our friend do something as stupid as that alone. So we gathered outside and went over the plan. Admittedly, it was not much of a plan. It went like this. Step 1 was find the mineshaft in question, which Baker set off to question his uncle about. The rest of us were left to come up with step 2, which, at the end of our brainstorming session, composed of us taking some form of weapons with us. 2 of us had handguns, one a little .38 revolver that one of the guy's dads had given him in case we ran into trouble on the road, and the other was a high power that the guy religiously carried, and still carries. The gun guys amongst us were not confident in the stopping power of the .38, but figured between it and the 9mm, we would at least be able to injure it enough to make it back off. The rest of us were relegated to walking sticks that were more like wooden poles, since that was what we could find laying around the area. Step 3 did not even get considered, and in hindsight, we probably should have come up with one. But hindsight is a bitch, so we aren't to talk about it yet. Baker walked out about half an hour later. In his hands was an old map. As he walked over, he yelled gleefully that it was a map from the early 70s, with each of the mines in the area marked, and the one in question circled with a black marker. He informed us it was about an hour's drive away, and asked if we were ready. So, with our poles tossed in the back, we stopped at a store to grab some flashlights and bottled water, then headed out into the desert on our monster hunting expedition. The way there we were all mostly silent, with Baker in the passenger seat and my brother from another mother driving, with another one of us reading a map to try and match up service roads with the map that Baker had. And surprisingly, we managed to find the mine after about 2 hours of backtracking and arguments. The entrance had a few dilapidated buildings scattered around, what we figured would have been the main office and rest area, along with machinery that looked like pulleys for the elevator or minecarts and some rails for said minecarts. There was also an old rusted out pickup truck parked close to what we thought would be the office, and one of the guys, a car guy through and through, lamented about it, I guess to try and lighten the mood a little. We scattered around the area, looking but not really knowing what we were looking for, honestly hoping for someone else to finally take the plunge and walk into the mine itself. And wouldn't you know it, Baker was the first one to do so. He walked over, looked the entrance over, then declared he was going in, which brought our attention back to why we were here. So, almost single file, we marched into the mine, flashlights at the ready. The inside was littered with mining tools laying here or there, debris like old and newer beer cans and trash, some broken down mining carts as well. We all agreed that we would not be trying to descend using the elevator shaft and instead opted to follow the rails further in. We did this for a bit, thanking the flashlights that we had, as the sunlight died down pretty quickly past the entrance, and once we rounded the first corner, it was non-existent. The temperature also dropped a few degrees, something we were all thankful for, as it was a scorcher of a day. Every now and then, we'd hear water dripping further ahead of us, so we, Baker really, decided to use that as a destination, his thinking being if there was something down there it would need to drink, and water dripping meant that there had to be a puddle or similar close enough, so why not start there? The walls of the mineshaft had some graffiti here and there, but it did not go too far in. We stopped seeing stuff like that about 10 minutes around the first bend we took. One of the guys thought that was odd, as back home he'd find graffiti all over the place in old mineshafts, even deeper ones, since people tend to use them for partying, and the farther in you are, the less likely the police or game wardens are to keep going in to evict you from the place. We brushed it off, but he had a point, though none of us wanted to say that. The water would drip about every minute or so, and eventually we found the source. A crack in the ceiling that was allowing the water to drip into an old rusty bucket. This caught our attention, as cracks don't just open over conveniently placed buckets so it can catch whatever drips out, and Baker took it as a sign that something was down here. Someone in the back spoke up about maybe some teenagers had done it during a party or something, but Baker pointed out the lack of trash or graffiti in the area, which silenced him and all of us for that matter. Baker, always the confident idiot, declared he was going deeper, since in his mind it was obvious his uncle was telling the truth, and whatever it was just had to be a little further in. We hated him for being so goddamn right. We continued to follow the rails, eventually coming to a larger room in the shape of a circle, and from what we could see, it must have been something like a crossroads type room, where mine carts could be sent off to different parts of the mine. A few broken or rustic carts were still on some of the rails, with some pickaxes leaning against one wall and what looked like a small office shed against another. We sort of split apart and began looking around the area, with Baker and myself checking out the office. The inside held an old-style desk and chair, a fridge, some file cabinets, with paper littering the floor. Everything was dusty as hell, and from the paperwork I read, it just looked like somewhere they kept hall amounts and worker timesheets. Nothing interesting. Baker had rifled through the desk, finding a set of old keys on a rabbit's foot keychain, and the two of us figured they belonged to the truck up top. That's when one of the guys called out to us for us to come to him, so the pair of us walked out and over to where the rest of us were gathering. The guy was knelt down, his light aimed at the dirt floor, illuminating a set of tracks that led off down a part of the shaft we had not been yet. They looked like dog prints, but longer and with an extra toe. The spacing between each print indicating that whatever had made them was long itself. We all looked at one another, and Baker had a look on his face that betrayed what he was thinking. Oh fuck, there is something down here. That was when we heard it. It sounded further down the shaft we were all currently clustered up against, and as one, all of us turned our lights to peer into the darkness. The sound of a hammer cocking, letting us know our 38 friend had drawn his weapon. The sound we heard, what sounded like bone scraping against bare metal, was slow, almost like whatever was causing it was doing it to try and unnerve us. It was working. My brother from another mother was the first one to voice the opinion of us getting the fuck out of Dodge right then and there. But Baker, fucking Baker, he wanted to at least see whatever it was, to see if it was just a normal animal or if his uncle was actually telling the truth. So he took a few slow steps into the shaft, then picked up the pace. The rest of us, not wanting our friend to get attacked, cussed his ass out, but we followed. 38 revolver in high power near the front and on either side of Baker. With each step we took, the noise got louder and more frequent until we heard a low hissing begin from ahead of us and around a slight curve of the tunnel. We stopped as one, our nerves beginning to fray, when Baker took one more step towards the noise, and then it happened. Something pale, wrinkled, and about the size of a mastiff charged around the corner, all of our lights hitting it square on at once, which seemed to blind it for a few moments and let us get a good look at it. Baker's uncle had not lied to us at all. Whatever it was looked like a rat and a dog had somehow crossbred, but along the way had lost all its hair. The claws on it looked similar to rats, but more squared at the tips, almost like they were meant for digging. The eyes were jet black and about the size of cue balls, its ears laid back against the head, its tail looking like one belonging to a dog with mange. It did not stay stunned for long, but us, we were frozen, especially Baker. And that's when the thing lunged and grabbed him by his leg, and all hell broke loose. The thing began trying to drag Baker away from us, Baker kicking at it with his free leg, and our two gun friends running up to get close enough to shoot it without hitting Baker. 38 friend dumped all 6 rounds into the thing's hips, causing it to let Baker go and start going after him. High power friend began to fire center mass into it as 2 of us grabbed Baker and began to drag him away, getting its attention away from 38 friend. We heard the unmistakable clicking of a dry chamber as he mag dumped into it, then began cussing up a storm as he reloaded and fired some more. The thing decided that we were too much at that point and retreated back the way we came, and we chose that moment to scoop Baker up into a fireman's carry and get the fuck out of Dodge. Our ears were ringing, our blood and adrenaline were pumping hard, and we were running like madmen. Then, we heard it, the sound that thing had been making, but coming from various of our mineshafts. We all turned into track stars, not wanting to be caught by a group of whatever the fuck that was, and soon found ourselves looking at the entrance to the mine. We spilled out into the sunlight, hoping and praying that they would not follow us, and made a beeline for our vehicle. At least, we would have, but we had company waiting for us. Parked behind our vehicle sat 3 SUVs, and around those stood a group of around 12 men in uniforms, wearing carriers and with rifles at the ready. We skidded to a stop, looking at the group, who was yelling at us to raise our hands and not to try anything funny. The guy carrying Baker said that our friend needed medical assistance, and one of the men said that would be handled once they knew we were not a threat. One of us, I can't remember who, yelled about not worrying about us, and instead they should point the rifles into the cave, since at this point you could still hear the hornet's nest we kicked up going off. 3 of the men moved to the entrance and took position, while the rest covered us, while 2 more began frisking us. The whole time, the one who seemed to be in charge eyed us, even more so when the revolver and high power were placed on the hood of our vehicle, and then he questioned us. Baker, thankfully, did all of the talking, probably because he was in pain and just wanted the shit to end. At the end of it all, the man called all of us idiots and said we were lucky to be alive, then ordered one of his men to begin cleaning up Baker's wound. They had taken our IDs, and while the men spoke, one of the others took photos of them before passing them back to us. He told us that we were on government property and were trespassing, but that they would let us off just this once, and that they knew who we were and where we lived, so we should keep everything hush-hush if we knew what was good for us. We all agreed, and once we were given our IDs back and the 2 guys were returned their weapons, we sped out of that place as fast as we could. All of us were quiet on the drive back to Baker's uncle, and when he saw all of us and the bandages on Baker's leg, he said that he warned us and called all of us stupid fucks. We spent the night there, all of us sitting around the fire and passing a bottle around, each of us deep in thought at what had happened. I spoke up once, telling everyone what I think we were all feeling. We should go home and forget this day and never talk about it again. The next day, we thanked his uncle for letting us stay, then piled into the vehicle and began the long drive back across country to home. We did not stop very often, only to change Baker's bandages, and were back home in 3 days' time, having alternated between drivers. My family asked how the road trip was, but they could tell something had happened, though they never pushed to hear about it too hard. My little sister knows some of it, and Baker's parents as well, since his uncle called a few months later to check on him. But outside of that, we don't speak about it to each other, at least the ones of us who are still alive. 38 friend bought the farm in Iraq 3 years later to an IED. Baker enlisted as well and was killed in Afghanistan about a year after 38 friend. Baker had been dead set against joining the military, but after what happened, something changed in him. The rest of us still keep in contact with each other and get together at least twice a year to remember Baker and 38 friend, but we never talk about that time in New Mexico. Only reason I told you all is because even if those men somehow find out about it, I'm dead in a few months anyway, as I have pancreatic cancer and the treatment is not stopping it any, and y'all will appreciate the story, even if most of y'all think it's fake. Just take some advice from me, and don't go exploring in old mineshafts in the New Mexico desert. You might not come out, or you may end up hurt, and no one wants to die alone in a mineshaft away from their loved ones.